Clear to me is through those tunnels, we're being trafficked, guns, drugs, and human beings, where some people were making a whole lot of money. And in fact, the officials in Calexico, when I was there, described to me, and these are folks who've been working there, doing tough work, and described to me with tears in their eyes about children as young as 5 years old who are being trafficked through those tunnels. And as Attorney General, I had placed a particular emphasis on combating transnational criminal organizations and on combating the money laundering that accompanies human trafficking. So to see those tunnels, an obvious point was and remains clear. Trafficking is an extremely heinous and profitable business. In fact, globally, human trafficking is a $150 billion business. And let's be clear, when we're talking about human trafficking, we are talking about some human beings who are essentially buying and selling other human beings. So today, we are here to focus on the estimated 25 million people around the world, as many as 1 in 3 who are under the age of 18, who are currently victims of human trafficking. Now, to understand the severity of human trafficking, to take on the scourge of human trafficking, we must all understand that human trafficking is multifaceted. Human trafficking happens both abroad and right here in the United States. When I was Attorney General, we found that 72% of trafficking victims in California were born right here in the United States. In 2020 alone, there were 11,000 instances of human trafficking that were reported in the United States. And mind you, those were only the cases that were reported. Experts suggest that the number of people at risk has also grown during COVID-19. So we must address with a sense of urgency what is happening in our own backyard. In the United States and worldwide, there are many types of work for which people are trafficked. Some people are lured from their homes or their home country with promises of a better future, only to be forced into sexual exploitation. Others are coerced and forced into labor or indentured servitude. Of the estimated 25 million people worldwide being trafficked, 65% are being forced to do domestic work, construction work, agricultural work, or manufacturing work. Last year alone, we seized nearly 1,500 shipments of merchandise made using forced labor, including things like clothes and electronics. The value? Nearly $500 million. To be sure, the economic impact of forced labor is significant, and it undermines our own supply chain, displacing American workers, driving down American wages, and creating an unlevel playing field for responsible American businesses. As a nation, we must require serious consequence and accountability for those who commit these crimes. And we must work to stop these crimes before they happen. In December, our administration issued our National Action Plan to combat human trafficking. Our plan centers on the key pillars of U.S. and global anti-trafficking efforts: prevention, protection, prosecution, and partnerships. Today, several of our departments and agencies will make announcements regarding how we will advance this plan. And there is a clear line that runs throughout our administration's work. We are focused on the most vulnerable. And based on my experience, the most vulnerable are women and girls, racial and ethnic minorities, LGBTQI+ people, indigenous people, people with disabilities, migrants, and children in the foster care system. When we identify who is most vulnerable, we can tailor our tactics and improve our strategy. We can look at what is putting communities at risk in order to improve our prevention efforts. And we can look at ways to reach those communities to ensure that support is trauma-informed and survivor-centered. In this work, our government, well, we need business leaders and nonprofit leaders, community leaders. We need all of you to partner with us. I have seen in my career the power of public-private partnership to address human trafficking. Whether it was the nonprofit that I teamed up with to support survivors, or the technology company I invited to help identify search terms that perpetrators were using. It is clear when we pool our resources and our expertise, we can maximize our impact. So those many years ago, after I visited Calexico and I saw the tunnels, I reached out to attorneys general from across our nation. And together we launched a unified effort to take on transnational crime. What was true then is true now. It will take all of us to address human trafficking. So I thank you all for being here today and for the work you do every day. Thank you.
Madam Vice President, thank you so much, not just for starting us off today, but for your leadership on this issue for a long, long time, for the extremely evocative words, but also for demonstrating in what you've done and the focus you're bringing to this now, how we can actually make practical progress in tackling the issue. And we're grateful for that leadership. We're grateful having you here today to start us off. Let me just say a bit more about why we're here today and what we're going to do over the next couple of hours. To pick up where the Vice President left off, we have an estimated 25 million people around the world subjected to human trafficking. Every one of them, a human being, exploited in some way for labor, for services, for sex, through force, through fraud, through coercion. Traffickers violate the most basic right of people everywhere to be free. We know, we feel the human toll. And of course, that is borne most of all by the victims of trafficking. But it's also worth noting that the impact extends far beyond those subject to trafficking to society as a whole. Human trafficking erodes the rule of law, the safety of our communities, the security of our borders, the strength of our economy. Forced labor, as the Vice President was speaking to, which is used to produce so many of the things that we buy and that we use every single day, from the food on our tables to the essential minerals that go into the devices probably a number of us are using at this very moment to log on to this event. The use of forced labor gives an unfair advantage to businesses that exploit workers, hurts those that follow fair labor practices, and misleads consumers about the real costs of production. This is by definition a global problem. Victims come from every part of the world, as documented in our annual report. Traffickers operate in virtually every country, including here in the United States. And because this is a global problem, we have to have a global coalition to confront it, one that cuts across government, business, civil society, all other parts of our society. We also have to find more ways to put effective pressure on governments that engage in or enable human trafficking. China, Cuba, North Korea, Russia. The recent bipartisan Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which cracks down on the profits Beijing can make from state-sponsored forced labor in Xinjiang and beyond, is one example of how we can do this. And I want to thank Congress for its leadership on this front. We need more efforts like that one. This is a crime that all parts of our government have to work together to address. And I think we have evidence of that commitment today just on the screen with the participation of 20 cabinets or departments and agencies. That shows, it demonstrates very vividly that this really is a whole of government effort. Every agency has a role to play, and our new National Action Plan provides a roadmap for how to do that. Again, here in the United States, but also around the world. So what we'd like to do is to ask principals from every federal government agency involved in this effort to set out their major priorities in tackling the trafficking problem, with a special focus on what's new in these efforts. And let me just add that, you know, this is an effort that has been underway for some years across multiple administrations. And a torch is passed to this administration to carry on the work, to dig even deeper, and to make genuine progress in combating trafficking. Before we hear from colleagues, I've got something that is a particular pleasure, and that is to recognize the recipients of the 2021 Presidential Award for Extraordinary Efforts to Combat Trafficking in Persons. So if you will bear with me for a few minutes, I want to recognize the awardees. As the Vice President said, one of the core priorities of the new National Action Plan is to persistently work to engage survivors in every part of the anti-trafficking effort, from prevention to protection to prosecution. Survivors are uniquely positioned to ensure that our policies and strategies are victim-centered and trauma-informed, which is crucial to their effectiveness. And that's exactly what Tanya Gould, who spent decades at this, has been doing. A survivor of domestic sex trafficking. Tanya has dedicated her life to helping people who've been victimized by sexual violence. And she's made herself an indispensable ally of institutions and individuals working to help and to empower survivors. She's developed trainings that teach doctors and nurses what to listen and look for to identify trafficking victims and how to communicate in a way that's respectful and meets victims where they are. She helped the Department of Education improve its guidance to teachers, to counselors, and others in schools to prevent kids from being targeted, to spot warning signs of trafficking, and to support students who are survivors. She's traveled the country, sharing her expertise with faith groups and student groups, with advocates and practitioners, and even helped write and produce a short film, all to help raise awareness about this crime and what we've got to do to tackle it. Tanya calls her work, and I quote, love in action. And Tanya never seems to run out of love for some of the people who need it most. Let me just read the award citation. For her unyielding commitment and contributions to the fight against human trafficking and bringing greater awareness of the issue to her community and the nation. Tanya, thank you, thank you, thank you, and congratulations. The second awardee is the Thai Community Development Center, known as the Thai CDC, represented here today by its founding director, Chanchanit Martoro. In many ways, the story of this organization is intertwined with the story of the fight against human trafficking in the United States. Back in 1995, the Thai CDC led a group of NGOs assisting 72 individuals in escaping from a secret sweatshop in El Monte, California. Many of the workers had been held under armed guard for 7 years, while being forced to work up to 18 hours a day for virtually no pay. The Thai CDC had never worked with trafficking survivors before, but the approach they pioneered became a model for efforts for decades to come. The organization provided the victims with treatment for trauma, legal aid as they fought to stay in the United States and to be reunited with their families, and support as they built new lives, from finding places to live to providing training on how to start their own businesses. In the more than 25 years since, the organization has worked on several more human trafficking cases, accompanying more than 500 victims. Beyond these cases, the Thai CDC's advocacy was instrumental to the passage of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. It led to reforms in the garment industry, broadened the definition of human trafficking to include practices like debt bondage. The organization's formal citation reads, and I quote, for its unending support in the fight against human trafficking and for bringing a greater awareness of the issue to the Thai community in an effort to see an end to human trafficking. So please join me in congratulating them, to congratulating Tanya for what has literally been and remains life-changing work. Thank you. So thanks again to our awardees. Thanks for the recognition that everyone is giving them. And now to move on with the agenda. I'd now like to ask.
You like that one-man clap there? That applause?
On the interagency efforts, the Senior Policy Operating Group. Carrie, over to you.
Thank you so much, Secretary Blinken and Vice President Harris. It is an honor to be with such an esteemed group of leaders committed to combating human trafficking. We know successful strategies to combat human trafficking require a whole of government approach. that prioritizes meaningful engagement with survivors. The 20 federal agencies that constitute the Senior Policy Operating Group coordinate with each other and with our partners, including the U.S. Advisory Council on Human Trafficking, to strengthen government policies and practices and effectively marshal anti-trafficking resources. I would like to acknowledge the invaluable contributions of the U.S. Advisory Council on Human Trafficking, particularly for your insightful 2021 report. Your expertise and talent continue to strengthen our federal anti-trafficking strategies. I am grateful for your dedication, particularly during a global pandemic, and wish we could thank you and applaud your efforts in person. Over the past year, the Senior Policy Operating Group has accomplished a great deal, including on implementing key aspects of the updated National Action Plan to combat human trafficking. I would like to share some of these achievements with you today. Last year, the Senior Policy Operating Group established 2 working groups, one to analyze the rights and protections granted to temporary employment-based visa holders and develop solutions for addressing gaps in those protections, and the other to develop best practices in implementing screening forms and protocols for federal officials who may encounter a human trafficking victim in the course of their regular duties. In addition, the National Action Plan recognizes an effective anti-trafficking response must embed racial justice and equity into its policies and programs. To this end, the Senior Policy Operating Group is working on an implementation plan to integrate racial equity throughout its anti-trafficking efforts and aims to release it later this year. The implementation plan will support the groups and agencies' work to carry out the executive order on advancing racial equity and support for underserved communities through the federal government. And it will highlight the importance of an intersectional approach. It will also complement agencies' individual work to implement the executive order on diversity, inclusion, equity, and accessibility in the federal workforce. In March 2021, the Procurement and Supply Chains Committee formed a subgroup to create a coordinated U.S. government voice in relation to increasing corporate compliance in combating forced labor in global supply chains. The subgroup is a place to implement a priority of the National Action Plan that calls for the development of initiatives to provide information about forced labor in product supply chains and highlight federal resources to key private sector partners, including proactive outreach to convene industry leaders. It has been a privilege to participate in the SPOG's efforts to combat human trafficking. Thank you for the opportunity to share our recent accomplishments and recommit ourselves to this important and necessary work.
Carrie, thank you very much, not just for today, but for your leadership in this effort every single day. We're grateful for it. Before getting to colleagues and hearing from them, there's one more person that I'd like to call on, and that is Suleiman Masood. He's a member of the U.S. Advisory Council on Human Trafficking, and will provide an update on its behalf. And just, Suleiman, before turning it over to you, I want to say how grateful we are to the Council for the consistent engagement, for the insights to improve our government's efforts, for making sure that the perspectives and expertise of those with lived experience.
Cheers, hooligans.
Part of everything we do, and for being such fierce champions for the victims and survivors everywhere. Over to you.
Thank you for the introduction, Secretary Blinken. Good afternoon. My name is Suleiman Masood, and I serve as Council Chair for the United States Advisory Council on Human Trafficking. On behalf of the Council, I'd like to extend our gratitude to the White House and Department of State for their continued support and partnership with the Council. I'd also like to thank each agency for its tireless efforts to address, inform, and prevent human trafficking domestically and abroad. To quote the late Nelson Mandela, "For to be free is not merely to cast off one's chains, but to live in a way that respects and enhances the freedom of others." Each of us here today share a similar vision. Bestowed upon us are responsibilities to empower survivors of all backgrounds and identities, be equitable and inclusive, and nurture and protect the communities we serve. Since the adoption of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, we have made tremendous strides to evolve our programming and advocacy to ensure meaningful engagement with survivors. I am proud to share that this Council released its most recent report at the end of 2021. Our report contains 19 recommendations informed by meetings with numerous PITF agencies. The report is organized by the Council's two committees, the Underserved Populations Committee and the Committee on the Administration of Justice. The Underserved Populations Committee has focused on meeting the needs of and promoting equity for marginalized, underserved populations. In our 2021 report, we called upon agencies to improve the quality of and access to resources and services without prejudice or bias, and address the cultural and root causes of human trafficking among underserved populations. The Committee on Administration of Justice has sought to strengthen accountability efforts. In our 2021 report, we called upon law enforcement agencies to collaborate with survivors through a multidisciplinary approach, uphold the Victims' Bill of Rights to support victims and their families, and promote promising practices to increase prosecutions of various forms of trafficking. Our 2021 report and the updated National Action Plan to Combat Human Trafficking share an essential theme in common: partnership. Simply put, addressing human trafficking requires a multidisciplinary effort. Addressing human trafficking requires meaningful communication. Addressing human trafficking requires transparent accountability. And finally, addressing human trafficking requires that as this crime evolves, so must we in our responses and our partnership strategies. As the Council looks to its 2022 report, we hope to increase awareness about the critical issues facing the anti-trafficking movement we raised in our 2021 report and support PITF agencies in implementing those recommendations. I am grateful for the opportunity to speak to you all, and I look forward to prioritizing our partnership in the future. Thank you for your time.
Suleiman, thank you very, very much. And really, it's hard to imagine better partners in this endeavor than the members of the council. So thank you so much for the work that we're doing together every day. Okay, so now I'm going to kick off hearing from all of our colleagues from all of the departments and agencies represented here. I take off my moderator hat. I'm putting on my State Department hat, just to start off by sharing 4 of the State Department's anti-trafficking priorities. And then I'll turn it over to all of our colleagues. So first, the State Department is continuing to work to integrate trauma and survivor-informed approaches across all of our anti-trafficking efforts. And as we're doing this, we're drawing not only on the U.S. Advisory Council on Human Trafficking, but also the State Department's Human Trafficking Expert Consultant Network, which is made up of survivors and other experts. Later this year, we plan to launch an online training on understanding trauma and trauma-informed approaches, which was developed in collaboration with the network and will provide a practical guide for everyone who has a stake in these efforts. Second, given the disproportionate impact of human trafficking on vulnerable and underserved individuals, we are bringing, and the Vice President alluded to this, an equity-based approach to our anti-trafficking work. For the 2022 Trafficking Persons Report, we expanded the data that we gather on the impact of government efforts and programs on underserved populations. Third, we're revitalizing and expanding our anti-trafficking collaboration with our neighbors, with Canada and Mexico. At the recent North America Leaders Summit in November, we agreed to restart a trilateral working group on trafficking in persons, and also to redouble our efforts to combat transnational organized crime. And we're working with partners across the Western Hemisphere to promote legal pathways to encourage orderly, safe, humane migration in ways that do not create or worsen vulnerabilities among migrants that traffickers can exploit. Fourth, we're looking at new ways to use visa restrictions, financial sanctions, to hold human traffickers to account and to freeze their illicit profits. We've been working very closely with Treasury on this, exploring whether we can nominate human traffickers for sanctions, building on the foreign assistance restrictions that we pursued for governments that we identify in the TIP report as the worst abusers in this space. Across these efforts, we continue to adapt our work to the ongoing impact of COVID-19, which made more people more vulnerable to trafficking, from school closures to the tens of millions of people the pandemic has pushed into extreme poverty. And that means looking systemically and systematically across our efforts and asking, what do we have to change in light of the pandemic? Where have new gaps, new vulnerabilities emerged that we have to address? And just to close out by giving a couple of examples. We are now checking on the welfare of domestic workers employed by foreign, mission, and international organization personnel here in the United States by phone and video, rather than meeting with them in person. We aim to restart in-person registration this year, expanding coverage nationwide, so long as the health conditions permit. And we're supporting anti-trafficking groups as they grapple with new challenges that have arisen or been worsened by COVID-19, like the program in Bangladesh to respond to the massive increase in online sexual exploitation that's come with greater travel restrictions and lockdowns. So these are just some of the ways that we are focusing our efforts in addressing these challenges. Having said that, it is now a great pleasure to give everyone a chance to give a brief update on what your respective agencies or departments have planned for the coming year. And with that, let me turn it over to my friend and colleague, Javier Becerra, to start us off.
Secretary Blinken, thank you very much. To everyone who's been part of this effort, I congratulate all of us for this effort and everyone who's going to be working with us on this. At HHS, we continue to implement the ambitious plans of the National Action Plan overall. We are bringing our full weight to strengthen the health and well-being of individuals, families, and communities impacted by human trafficking. Today, I'm announcing the establishment of the HHS Task Force to prevent human trafficking, which will increase our coordination and collaboration across our various agencies in the department. The task force will scale prevention, it will expand access to services, and it will build scientific understanding. On prevention, we will release the department's first Human Trafficking Prevention Action Plan, incorporating lessons learned from the implementation of the Human Trafficking Prevention Education Demonstration Program. We'll incorporate gender and racial equity principles in the development of new public awareness and outreach strategies to better reach and reflect the diverse communities experiencing human trafficking. We will establish a technical working group to prevent forced labor in healthcare supply chains, to hold industry listening sessions to prevent human trafficking in direct care services such as child care and elder care, and we will publish information resources. On access, we will publish several funding opportunities with a strengthened equity-focused program design, including new grant awards focused on gaps in services for survivors of labor trafficking, child trafficking, and those in the Pacific region. We will coordinate with state, federal, and non-governmental organizations to further strengthen support for unaccompanied children at risk of human trafficking. And we will implement regional initiatives to increase access to key gaps in services, particularly substance use and mental health, housing, and economic mobility services. On building scientific understanding, we will release a supplemental issue of the Surgeon General's public health reports on what we have learned after 20 years of public health progress on human trafficking. We will issue a call for papers on the impact of COVID-19 on human trafficking and intersecting forms of violence, and implement research on demand and other underlying factors of human trafficking. And we will identify opportunities to open more data on human trafficking from relevant HHS programs, and will continue to modernize HHS's system for collecting data on human trafficking. We do all of this hoping to add to this opportunity to really tackle this issue of human trafficking. So in closing, we look forward to working with our federal and external partners to respond to human trafficking through a preventative approach that promotes innovation and advances equity in reducing structural barriers. Thank you.
Javier, thank you so much. Thanks for that comprehensive laydown, and thank you for the extraordinary leadership that you're showing on this. It's my pleasure now to turn to the Secretary of the Treasury. Janet, over to you.
Thank you, Tony. It's a pleasure to speak about Treasury's role in combating human trafficking. As many of you know, when federal agencies train people to recognize the signs of trafficking, they often give them very clear pictures. A person with very few belongings, for instance, who may be living with their employer and is unable to speak to you alone. The idea is there are identifiable signs of human trafficking. And if we're vigilant as we move about the everyday world, we can stop it. Well, the same holds true for the more arcane and numbers-driven world of the financial system. We can recognize the patterns of human trafficking there too. The fact that human traffickers launder their money through shell companies or cryptocurrencies or even traditional banks is not the worst aspect of their crime, but it is often the most effective way to catch them. One of the best strategies we have for ending modern day slavery is following the money. At Treasury, we've spent the last 6 years developing the tradecraft to do just that. The expertise to recognize the patterns of human trafficking in money flows. In the past, we've worked with various financial institutions, hundreds of banks, pooling our information and piecing together which accounts belong to traffickers. This way, we could lock them out of the financial system and expose their crimes. We've continued that work this year in a few important ways. We've partnered with DOJ, DHS, and the gaming industry, for instance, training employees at more than 400 casinos to recognize when a human trafficker is trying to launder their money. We've also begun the important process of exposing who owns certain shell companies in this country. In some states, almost anyone can establish a company without disclosing the beneficial or actual owner. And this gives cover to all sorts of criminals, including human traffickers, to hide their illegal gains. And until recently, it would have been very hard to stop them. But in 2020, Congress passed the Corporate Transparency Act, which Treasury's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, or FinCEN, is now beginning to implement. The law allows us to build a national database of who owns what shell company, something that will let us better expose and deter human trafficking. There's one final point I want to make. I think we have an obligation not just to go after the perpetrators of modern day slavery, but to help the victims of it as well. And this is something we're thinking about at Treasury. We know one of the first things these traffickers do is strip their victims of their phones and IDs, which means that when they finally gain their freedom, trafficking survivors emerge into the world with little ability to navigate it. They can't get a driver's license. They can't get a bank account. There are broad policies we're promoting to break down these barriers. Digital ID is one, but we also have flexibility in our regulatory framework, which has allowed various banks to set up processes so that victims of human trafficking can get bank accounts and restart their lives. And I'm hopeful that when we participate in this meeting next year, we'll have more to share with you on this front. So thank you again, and I look forward to working with all of you on this crucial issue.
Janet, thank you so much. And it's
So we're getting a digital ID, is that what she said?
to bear its incredibly sophisticated tools in trying to take down the traffickers, but I think equally compelling and moving to hear you talk about the other side of the coin, the victims, and what you're doing to try to help them as they emerge from trafficking. So thank you so much for sharing that. Mr. Attorney General, Merrick.
Thanks, Tony, and good afternoon to everyone. Human trafficking is an insidious crime. Traffickers exploit some of the most vulnerable members of our society and cause their victims unimaginable harm and trauma. Combating human trafficking demands, as everyone has said, a whole of government approach. And that's why the Justice Department was pleased to support the development of the President's National Action Plan. This week, I will be submitting to Congress 2 annual trafficking in persons reports required under the Trafficking Victims Protection Act for fiscal years 2019 and 20 that were unfortunately not submitted by the prior administration. These important reports detail activities and programs across the U.S. government to combat human trafficking. Soon after issuing those two reports, the Justice Department will be issuing its new National Anti-Human Trafficking Strategy. Our strategy is aligned with the foundational pillars of the President's National Action Plan, namely prevention of human trafficking, prosecution of human trafficking cases, protection of human trafficking victims and survivors, and partnership at every level of government. Today, I would like to highlight three areas of our focus. First, we are expanding our capacity to prevent human trafficking. Prevention requires a trauma-informed, culturally responsive approach. To this end, we're developing a victim screening protocol to identify potential trafficking victims and encourage victims to share important information. We are also working together with federal, state, local, tribal, and territorial law enforcement partners to develop prevention strategies and conduct advanced trainings. Second, we are expanding our capacity to prosecute perpetrators of human trafficking crimes. Human trafficking cases are complex, and successfully investigating and prosecuting them requires partnership across all levels of government. Last year, we established Joint Task Force Alpha in partnership with DHS. Its mission is to work within the United States and with our foreign partners in the Northern Triangle and Mexico to dismantle criminal networks that endanger, abuse, and exploit migrants and engage in human trafficking. In addition, as part of our commitment to ending forced labor, DOJ's Human Trafficking Prosecution Unit will launch a forced labor initiative in collaboration with the FBI and DHS. Meanwhile, our law enforcement components are stepping up their efforts to investigate human trafficking crimes. For one example, the FBI's Child Exploitation and Human Trafficking Task Forces operate within nearly every one of the FBI's 56 field offices to recover victims and investigate traffickers at the state and federal level. And just last weekend, the FBI's Los Angeles field office worked with its local law enforcement partners to announce a major recovery effort of missing children and trafficking victims. As another example, at the end of 2021, the U.S. Marshals Service announced that it had assisted with the recovery of 950 critically missing children, a 145% increase over the previous year. Finally, we are focused on providing protection and trauma-informed assistance to victims and survivors of human trafficking. Last year, DOJ awarded more than $85 million in funding to combat human trafficking. In the year ahead, our Office for Victims of Crime, which manages the largest amount of federal funding dedicated to supporting victims of human trafficking, will continue to award funding to combat trafficking and support victim services. This will include access to safe, stable housing options. The Justice Department remains committed to our shared goals of preventing human trafficking, detecting human trafficking, prosecuting the perpetrators of human trafficking crimes, and prosecuting and empowering survivors. Thank you very much.
Merrick, thank you very much for sharing that and for the important work that you're doing. It is now a pleasure to turn the floor to the Secretary of Homeland Security, Secretary Mayorkas. Ali, over to you.
Secretary Blinken, Tony, thank you so much for leading this effort on all of our behalves. In early 2019, the Baltimore County Police Department requested help from special agents of our department's Homeland Security investigations. The police were investigating a local robbery that led them to a very dangerous perpetrator of sex trafficking and drug distribution. The suspect was creating and using drug dependency as a tool of coercion and manipulation, forcing his victims into the sex trade from which he profited. Our federal agents worked with the local police, tracked the offender, interviewed witnesses, and executed electronic search warrants on social media platforms. 8 victims were identified, all of whom struggled with the drug dependencies their trafficker had cultivated. We built the case together. As we did so, our victim assistance specialists provided support to the victims. They connected them with addiction services, coordinated appearances at trial, arranged for their testimony, and communicated with the families. 2 months ago, the trafficker was convicted and sentenced to 30 years in prison. Our team continues to work with the survivors to move them into a safe, secure, and stable living environment. We did this all in partnership with the Department of Justice, the Department of Health and Human Services, and our other federal and community partners. I'm very proud to be a part of today's event and to work in support of the task force, representing the dedicated public servants across the Department of Homeland Security, who in partnership with all of you, commit themselves to combating human trafficking every day. We do so because we understand profoundly that the dignity of every individual must be protected and every individual deserves safety. Tony, once again, thank you for your leadership, and we're grateful for the President's leadership and direction, including through his creation of our Interagency Task Force. We in the Department of Homeland Security do a lot to fight against human trafficking. During this past year, ICE's Homeland Security investigations made more than 2,360 human trafficking arrests and assisted more than 728 victims. U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services approved 559 T visas for victims of trafficking. Customs and Border Protection seized more than 1,550 shipments containing nearly $500 million in merchandise linked to forced labor overseas, a 9-fold increase over the previous year. Just yesterday, in our role as lead agency of the Forced Labor Enforcement Task Force, the department launched implementation of the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, calling for public input on how to best ensure that goods produced in whole or in part by forced labor in the Xinjiang and elsewhere in China are not imported into the United States. Earlier today, I designated a senior accountable official to prevent human trafficking in all DHS contracts and acquisitions. All of these efforts speak to two foundational principles. First is the importance of combating human trafficking using a victim-centered approach across our policies, programs, and activities. This is not only the right thing to do, it also enables law enforcement to better detect, investigate, and prosecute the traffickers. The second principle is partnership. DHS is fundamentally a department of partnerships. This is certainly true in our fight against human trafficking. As we saw in Baltimore, we collaborate with state and local law enforcement who share our commitment. Through the DHS Blue campaign, we deepen these partnerships with state, local, tribal, and territorial governments. Every day, we work directly with victims and non-governmental organizations, and we're proud to partner with all of you. Tony, thank you again.
Ali, thank you very, very much. And thank you for making this really a whole of DHS effort, as we're hearing from what you shared with us today. To the Interior, Deb.
Thank you so much. Really happy to be here and appreciate the opportunity to join. I appreciate you hosting this year's task force meeting, Secretary Blinken, to highlight this administration's work to combat human trafficking, and most importantly, to help elevate the voices of survivors. I'm excited to find new pathways to get the critical resources that survivors need most. This administration has made public safety a top priority across all sectors, including human trafficking. I'm particularly pleased with the focus on the missing and murdered Indigenous peoples crisis, where there has been a historical lack of resources and attention, and where human trafficking is prevalent. As stated in the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights Broken Promises report, Native Americans suffer from one of the nation's highest rates of crime and victimization in large part due to the structural and jurisdictional barriers that criminal justice systems face in Indian country. This is why, as one of my first actions, I launched the Missing and Murdered Unit in the Bureau of Indian Affairs. This unit is focused on marshaling federal law enforcement resources to resolve cases of missing and murdered American Indians and Alaska Natives by working directly with tribes and the Justice Department to enhance data and evidence collection. At Interior, we have also prioritized implementation of the Not Invisible Act. This is an issue close to my heart. I know what it's like to worry if my sister's friends and relatives would go missing without a trace. I was a champion for this legislation in Congress and now have the honor of implementing this law with the help of Attorney General Garland as we establish the Not Invisible Act Commission. This commission will bolster intergovernmental coordination to identify and combat violent crime against Native Americans by establishing an advisory committee composed of law enforcement, tribal leaders, federal partners, service providers, and most importantly, survivors. The Not Invisible Act Commission will develop final recommendations and best practices for this administration to improve federal coordination, help resolve jurisdictional complexities, and find lasting solutions to missing persons and human trafficking cases that disproportionately impact Indigenous people. With the support of the entire Biden-Harris administration, we can address this crisis. We don't just need resources, we need federal leadership across all agencies to elevate a crisis response to help locate missing and murdered and Indigenous peoples who have been trafficked. We also need to prioritize victim resources for all communities, because if we're serious about ending cycles of abuse, we must invest in tools that prevent survivors from being victimized again. I'm proud to serve in this administration and on this task force. Thank you all for your commitment to center the voices of those who have been left behind. We must ensure that we do everything we can to address human trafficking and bring women and children home, regardless of their age, race, or economic background. Thank you so much again, Secretary Blinken.
Secretary Haaland, thank you, and thank you for the special focus that you're bringing so effectively to Native Americans. Now over to the Department of Agriculture. Secretary Vilsack. Tom. Tom, I think you may be muted. We are still not.
Need some assistance.
At least I'm not.
Try one more time. There we go. Sorry about that. I want to thank you, Tony, for this opportunity to be here today. And certainly we are honored to be part of the President's Interagency Task Force as we seek at USDA to strengthen our efforts together in combating human trafficking. Certainly want to thank the President and Vice President for their leadership and to acknowledge the extraordinary work of my colleagues on the Cabinet as have been outlined here today, especially that of the State Department. I'd like to highlight two ways in which we at USDA are involved in this whole of government mission to put an end to this devastating trafficking of persons. First, USDA is incredibly proud to be partnering with the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services to help encourage eligible individuals to naturalize and become U.S. citizens. Come on. You know, immigrants are a vital part of the fabric of this country, and for USDA, they play a very important role in the food supply chain. We also know that victims are less likely to go to the police if they are undocumented. That's why citizenship is so incredibly important. USDA's national programs connect with communities in both rural and urban environments and present a unique opportunity to reach many more immigrant communities, inviting them to fully participate in civic life as new U.S. citizens. In 2021, we launched pilot projects to help the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services better connect with agricultural workers in 4 key regions around the country, in the Imperial Valley in California, the Rio Grande Valley in Texas, Central Florida, and in Central Pennsylvania. And we're looking to expand significantly that effort in counties across the United States in 2022. Additionally, USDA is providing 4 deliverables as part of the overall U.S. strategy for addressing the root causes of migration in Central America, focusing on economic insecurity and inequality. As part of this strategy, we are building resilience to address climate change and food insecurity, in particular, by increasing the number of communities and farmers served in Guatemala specifically. We're fostering a business-enabling environment for inclusive agricultural growth through the Cochrane Fellowship Program for Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. We're enhancing workforce development, health, and education services, notably through an extension and expansion of the USDA McGovern Dole school feeding program. This $45 million investment will increase the number of communities and school children served via these programs in Guatemala and Honduras, and indirectly impacting the flow of migration by providing school meals and literacy education that reduces food insecurity. And we're enhancing school-based agricultural education and youth extension in Guatemala, helping to meet food needs through USDA's International Agriculture Education Fellowship Program. So I'm pleased to share our shared commitment across all federal departments to do our part, along with our fellow colleagues. It will take all of us, Tony, as you well know, in working together to address the deep systemic and underlying causes that lead to the tragic occurrences of human trafficking in our country and transnationally. Thank you for the opportunity to participate today.
Tom, thank you very much. And I think, as we're hearing from colleagues, and as Tom just underscored, it is, I think, increasingly evident why this has to be and is, thankfully, a whole of government effort, because there are so many different angles to this and to dealing with trafficking effectively that really do call on the particular competencies and expertise that virtually all of our agencies and departments bring to bear on this. And we're hearing that, I think, very vividly this afternoon. So thank you, Tom. Over to the Secretary of Transportation, Pete.
Well, thanks, Secretary Blinken. Good afternoon, and congratulations to the honorees, and thank you to all of my colleagues across the administration working together on this. Around the world, millions of people are trafficked through transportation systems. Victims are trafficked aboard airplanes, on buses, subways, trains, taxis, ships, private vehicles. And those who escape are often relying on transportation networks to get away. So
is that how you guys do it?
Transportation has a vital role to play in the fight against human trafficking. This year, we're continuing our work with over 500 transportation leaders who have signed our pledge against human trafficking to train more than 1.3 million employees across all of the modes of transportation, just as we regularly train our 55,000 employees here at DOT. And we're continuing to encourage transportation stakeholders to sign up if they haven't already. Anyone following this conversation right now can do so at transportation.gov/stophumantrafficking. We're also rolling out new training and public awareness tools that we've developed with input from survivors themselves to help transportation employees and the traveling public learn how to recognize and report suspected cases. Through our annual Combating Human Trafficking and Transportation Impact Award, we are recognizing innovative solutions to the problem. And our Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration will continue requiring every state to permanently ban drivers convicted of trafficking from operating commercial vehicles. On the aviation side, we are partnering with Secretary Mayorkas and the Department of Homeland Security to expand the Blue Lightning Initiative, which is a training program that has already trained over 200,000 frontline aviation workers. And with ICAO, the UN's International Civil Aviation Organization, we're working on a comprehensive strategy to combat trafficking in aviation. And we're hoping to advance similar efforts with the IMO, the International Maritime Organization. Finally, I want to mention that under the bipartisan infrastructure law, we are reestablishing DOT's Advisory Committee on Human Trafficking, which is going to work with the Attorney General's office to provide regular reports and information with best practices, recommendations, and analysis of human trafficking violations that involve commercial motor vehicles. We know that stopping human trafficking is the responsibility of every transportation leader at every level of our many transportation systems in the US and every member of the traveling public. And with the training, resources, and will, we know that we can save so many people from the scourge of human trafficking across the many modes of transportation. Thank you again, and back over to you, Secretary.
Pete, thank you very, very much, and greatly appreciate the work that DOT is doing both here at home and internationally to tackle this problem. Over to the Director of National Intelligence, Avril.
Thanks so much, Tony. Really appreciate you doing this. And we in the intelligence community are very focused on this issue. And I'm really grateful to have an opportunity to talk about our work and the role that we play alongside our colleagues. Global human trafficking, whether forced labor or sex trafficking, is a serious threat to U.S. national security. And we're committed to supporting the federal government's efforts in this area, including implementing the National Action Plan to combat human trafficking that you discussed. Human trafficking, in addition to the heinous toll it takes on human beings, provides a reliable source of revenue and support to illicit actors and governments engaging in forced labor. The scale and severity of global human trafficking is moreover affected by increased migration, displacement resulting from conflicts, economic crises, and environmental change. And these issues, along with cyber-based trafficking and the corrupt actors and networks involved in global human trafficking, are all matters that the intelligence community is committed to monitoring, understanding, and ultimately providing information on to those who can hold traffickers accountable, as well as those who are looking to reduce the vulnerability of communities who are otherwise vulnerable to human trafficking. And not only do we see the way in which human trafficking fuels the growth of transnational organized crime and deprives people of human rights and freedoms, but also how it negatively affects global health, with longstanding psychological and individuals, families, and communities, and the disproportionate impact it has on historically marginalized and underserved communities, mentioned earlier by the Vice President. The intelligence community works closely with other government agencies to improve information sharing on trafficking, along with the impact of trafficking between intelligence elements and federal, state, local, and tribal law enforcement, and we are working to improve those efforts. I'll just give two examples of our recent work that highlights how we're implementing the National Action Plan. In July of last year, the intelligence community and law enforcement agencies published the first law enforcement intelligence assessment, which characterized significant and sustained human trafficking threats with a nexus to the United States, and furthermore identified key human trafficking threats, the enabling factors that facilitate those threats, and how such threats are evolving. And then this year, we partnered with the Department of State, with Tony, your folks, and Allie's folks at the Department of Homeland Security, really to establish an information sharing platform for the intelligence and the law enforcement communities that consolidates federal, state, local, and tribal law enforcement in one location. And the IC will continue to leverage these partnerships and outreach efforts to better enable our law enforcement and international partners to disrupt and dismantle trafficking networks around the globe. So thanks very much for what you're doing, and really appreciate all the work we get to do with our colleagues on this issue.
Thanks, Avril, so much. And yes, this partnership is critical to our own efforts around the world, and we're really grateful for it. So thank you. Now to the single most important person on this call for all of our efforts, because the resources necessary to undertake them. Shalonda, Office of Management and Budget, over to you.
Thank you, Secretary Blinken, for bringing this group together. It's my pleasure, honor. Thank you for having OMB as a part of this presentation. I want to thank the staff at OMB and all of your staffs across the government on their work on this important issue.
Go easy on her, hooligans. Okay, go easy on her.
Role in the executive branch. You heard Secretary Blinken talk about our budget functions, but we also set procurement policies across the government, and we're here to ensure that those procurement dollars are effectively used to combat trafficking, and where appropriate, bring agencies together to coordinate efforts. OMB also establishes the government's acquisition policy, and our procurement team is working to ensure that taxpayer funds are never used to support trafficking in persons in any way, shape, or form. In accordance with the priority action in the National Action Plan to combat human trafficking, OMB will facilitate increased dialogue within the federal government, as well as with the contractor community and NGOs, to better align government efforts to combat trafficking and federal procurement. OMB's Office of Federal Procurement Policy works with our federal agency colleagues to identify areas that increase risk of trafficking and best integrate best practices to reduce the risk of forced labor in our supply chain. Our team has also recently updated the Combating Trafficking in Persons course to better equip the government workforce to recognize not only signs of forced labor, but also the practices closely associated with trafficking, which are prohibited in all federal contracts. Finally, OMB will continue to work with the agencies to ensure they bring an equity lens to anti-trafficking work done through the Senior Policy Operating Group. I know my team looks forward to continuing our partnership with this task force and to working together with federal contractors to combat human trafficking. And thank you, Secretary Blinken, for bringing us together on this important issue.
Shalonda, thank you very much. Greatly appreciate all of these efforts and the important coordinating role as well that you've been playing in this. Over to the U.S. Trade Representative, Catherine.
Thank you so much, Tony. It's a pleasure to be with you. Good afternoon. I'm very glad to be with all of you today as we discuss our administration's commitment to this extremely important issue. At USTR, we are committed to using trade policy to support and empower workers in the United States and around the world. That perspective and expertise is important as we advance the Biden-Harris administration's National Action Plan to combat human trafficking, especially in the fight to eradicate forced labor. We know that we can achieve more durable and lasting change if our trading partners also commit to these principles and incorporate them into their practices. And that is why the president fought to include forced labor on the agenda at the G7 Leaders Summit in Cornwall in June of last year. The G7 trade ministers' forced labor statement from October underscores that forced labor has no place in the global trading system. It also lays out a shared vision for tackling forced labor in global supply chains. Eradicating forced labor is not just a moral imperative. It also is critical to protecting US workers from unfair competition and raises global labor standards. As the United States continues to be a global leader in this effort, I am pleased to announce that USTR will develop our first ever trade strategy to combat forced labor. The development of the strategy will include a thorough interagency review of our existing trade policies and tools used to combat forced labor, including forced child labor, to determine areas that may need strengthening and gaps that need to be filled. We will use this analysis to establish objectives, priorities, new tools, and key action items to advance our goals. We will also create an inclusive process that maximizes input from stakeholders, including labor organizations, civil society, survivors, and the private sector. Finally, we will continue to advance this work in our trade engagements around the world. This will include continued work through the World Trade Organization fisheries subsidies negotiations to address the prevalent use of forced labor on fishing vessels. Using the Trade and Technology Council to develop concrete actions for the United States and the European Union to coordinate on combating forced and child labor. Monitoring and upholding our strong forced labor obligations under the United States, Mexico, Canada agreement to prohibit the importation of goods produced by forced labor. And finally, contributing our expertise on global supply chains in the implementation of the Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act. By working with our trading partners, including those in the Indo-Pacific, we will demonstrate that we can raise global labor standards and provide an example for the rest of the world to follow. I look forward to continuing to work with all of you as we develop and implement the strategy. Thank you.
Catherine, thank you very much, and thanks for the partnership on this. And it's really good to hear about the upcoming trade strategy to combat forced labor. So we're looking forward to seeing that. Thank you. And now to Ambassador Linda Thomas-Greenfield, the U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations. Linda.
Thank you, Secretary Blinken. Last year, we worked with our allies and partners across the UN to ensure that combating human trafficking was a top priority in Vienna, in Geneva, here in New York, and throughout the UN system. At the 2021 Commission on the Status of Women and during the UN General Assembly, we fought for strong language in all of our resolutions and high-level declarations and underscored the importance of accountability mechanisms to counter human trafficking. We also actively participated in the UN's high-level meeting for the appraisal of the UN Plan of Action to combat human trafficking held in this past November. We stressed the importance of implementing the Palermo Protocol and the Global Plan of Action to combat trafficking in persons. I have also personally met with survivors whose painful and powerful stories remind us that this work is urgent as it is crucially important. In 2022, we will use our status as a member of the Human Rights Council to advance our priorities and draw greater attention to the scourge of human trafficking. We will propose anti-trafficking language in resolutions, political declarations, and other negotiated texts wherever we can, especially during the Commission on Social Development in February, the Commission on the Status of Women in March, and the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues in April. Next fall, we will work with the Philippines to advance our priorities in its biannual anti-trafficking resolution. And we will continue to fight for robust anti-trafficking language during the UN General Assembly, both in country-specific and relevant thematic resolutions. Our fight to elevate this issue will simultaneously require us to engage with vigor on issues like early and forced child marriage and violence against women and girls. The COVID-19 pandemic has led not only to higher rates of forced and early marriage, but also spiking rates of gender-based violence. The pandemic has taken a devastating toll on vulnerable and marginalized populations, particularly those who are often targeted for labor and sexual trafficking. Here at the UN, we will continue to bring a spotlight to this issue and to engage vigorously to fight trafficking across the globe. Thank you again to President Biden, Vice President Harris, and particularly to you, Secretary Blinken, for your leadership on this important issue. Thank you.
Linda, my thanks to you, and I think the global platform that you have could not be more important, and your voice in particular could not be more important in bringing countries together to make this a common cause. So thank you for that leadership. Over to Kath Hicks, the Deputy Secretary of Defense. Kath. Kath, I think you're on mute.
Great. Hopefully you can hear me now. Good. Good afternoon, Secretary Blinken. It's my pleasure to be representing the Department of Defense today on this important topic. At DoD, we've been actively engaged in monitoring and combating trafficking in persons through a dedicated Office of Combating Trafficking in Persons. The department has already released both a Combating Trafficking in Persons student guide and a companion parent resource guide. These are designed for military-connected high school students and their families to help them learn about human trafficking and how to prevent it through near-peer stories, survivor stories, and interactive quizzes. DoD has also developed the Survivors' Voices webpage on its combating trafficking in persons website. Through video and written narratives, this page features insights from survivors of trafficking, and it contains information to help others in similar situations. This year, we plan to add 6 to 8 more stories to the Survivor Voices webpage. More generally this year, we are focused on furthering our lines of effort, prevention through awareness training and outreach, addressing demand reduction, and engaging survivors. To date, we've already undertaken a number of activities to advance these priorities. Just this month, for instance, as part of National Human Trafficking Prevention Month, we've had 2 survivors speak at our quarterly Combating Trafficking in Persons Task Force meeting. In assisting DoD's Northern and Indo-Pacific commands in their work with Afghan refugees on designated U.S. installations, the department has prepared materials focused specifically on human trafficking in the Afghan refugee populations. We've provided background information describing common types of trafficking in Afghanistan in English, Dari, and Pashto. Additionally, we've had materials prepared that provide the signs and indicators of trafficking, as well as specialized screening tools for interviewers. Looking ahead, we're working to develop a resource kit for all DoD personnel involved in contracting and procurement activities. This resource kit will be a user-friendly set of job aids, including one-pagers, short desk guides, checklists, case studies, and other resources, divided into 5 platforms that follow the contracting process. Each platform has a narrator to guide acquisition personnel through the platform. And our Combating Trafficking in Persons office also has sponsored 3 U.S. Air Force contracting officers for their Naval Postgraduate School Master of Business Administration research project. Their work focused on identifying gaps in human trafficking awareness in DoD acquisition. DoD will now work to implement their recommendations relating to workforce training and creating an online tool for filtering procurement data. In short, through initiatives such as these, we at the Department of Defense will continue to do our part in monitoring and combating trafficking in persons. Thank you so much, Tony.
Kat, thank you very much for sharing that and for the leadership that DoD is showing on this. Now we go to the Department of Commerce. Don Graves.
Well, Mr. Secretary, thank you for the opportunity to join my colleagues across government to speak today about the Department of Commerce's contributions to the administration's efforts to combat this scourge of human trafficking. Tony, as you and everyone else on this task force knows, protecting global human rights is central to our values as Americans. We have a responsibility to address violations, particularly against the most vulnerable populations. While the Commerce Department is relatively new to this task force, our agency plays a unique and important role, particularly in addressing the abhorrent use of forced labor. Using its export control authority, Commerce's Bureau of Industry and Security contributes to these efforts by restricting exports of certain items to entities found to engage in activities that are counter to the national security or the foreign policy of the US, including the protection of human rights. BIS has added 15 commercial and government entities to the entity list because of their implication in human rights violations, and specifically the use of forced labor. All 15 of these entities were found to be involved in the use of forced labor of Muslim minorities in China's Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region and are now subject to comprehensive export controls. Our efforts to combat human trafficking also relies on the immense expertise of the International Trade Administration. American businesses, both here and abroad, are some of our best resources against the use of forced labor in global supply chains. ITA's deep knowledge of supply chains in various industries allows us to provide insight to our private sector partners to assist in identifying and addressing the use of forced labor. ITA is implementing one of the National Action Plan's priority actions by leading a robust interagency effort to develop guidance and direct industry to critical information that will allow businesses to establish their own policies and procedures to prevent the use of goods and services made with forced labor. One of the key industries that has historically been plagued by illegal and unjust labor practices is the seafood sector. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's expertise with the seafood supply chain is critical in our work to identify potential forced labor practices on fishing vessels, as well as seafood products that may have been produced using forced labor. NOAA's contributions include strengthening existing initiatives to develop due diligence standards and market-based solutions to eliminate economic incentives to forced labor in the fishing industry, as well as partnering with like-minded countries to promote safe and decent working conditions. Looking ahead, Commerce will continue to fully utilize its resources in advancing our commitment to protecting human rights and promoting our American values. I look forward to partnering with you on this important work. So thank you for your leadership, Tony, for the great work that's being done across the administration, and thank you again for the opportunity to speak this afternoon.
Tony, we couldn't hear you.
I'm sorry. My apologies. I think I was on mute this time. I was just thanking Don for the vital role that Commerce is playing, and now to another very critical player in these efforts. Julie, over to you and the work of the Department of Labor.
Thank you so much, Secretary Blinken.
Thank God they're not in control of anything important.
Good to be with all of you today. I actually worked
It's the remix.
cases for a long time as an attorney and in trafficking, including with today's honoree champ, brave garment workers trafficked from Thailand and forced to work behind barbed wire and under armed guard in an apartment complex outside of Los Angeles was something I saw and was inspired by firsthand. That case was one of the catalysts for the federal law establishing this task force. And I carry the lessons learned and the sense of urgency from that case to my position in this administration. In my time as the Deputy Secretary of Labor, I've already seen some terrible cases of human trafficking, and I'm grateful for the Vice President's acknowledgement of the fact that these abuses are not limited to any one industry or geographic area or community. The Department of Labor is often the first government authority to witness and report abusive labor practices. Whether it is in farms, hotels, factories, or restaurants, we work with sister agencies across federal and local authorities so traffickers are brought to justice. A recent case, Operation Blooming Onion, was an interagency effort that uncovered Central American migrant workers being forced to dig onions with their hands at gunpoint on farms in Georgia. These types of abuses have no place in our labor market or global supply chains. In addition to ramping up our referrals over the coming year, we will also continue to work to ensure that all trafficking victims in the United States receive the back wages that they're entitled to under the law. We know that in the US, trafficked migrant workers are often reluctant to come forward, as others have already said, fearing deportation. Under Secretary Walsh's leadership, the Department of Labor is exploring ways to expand protections for victims who have employment-based non-immigrant visas and those without legal immigration status. Our Wage and Hour Division plans to issue new guidance on the certification of U and T non-immigrant visa applications to our staff so we can protect survivors of human trafficking and encourage them to come forward. We will also work more closely with foreign governments to ensure that the recruitment of overseas workers for US jobs is fair and free of exploitation. To better equip the department's investigators to combat trafficking, this year we're providing internal training to our investigators on indicia of trafficking and on taking action that is, as the Vice
Her Windows XP is glitching out.
Blinken said, trauma-informed and survivor-centered.
What are we looking at now?
We will step up our engagement with local human trafficking task forces and partners who have relationships with communities at risk. Department of Labor's role. Additional resources in identifying both and identifying those goods. In the coming year, we will be looking closely at abuses of this research in September 2022. My experience in this space has shown that the more we vilify or discount immigrants and workers,
This is what the voice in Biden's head sounds like.
we make them. Secretary Walsh and I and the entire Department of Labor look forward to continuing to work with our interagency partners and other key allies in the United States and abroad, and all of our colleagues on this task force to combat and end the egregious form of worker abuse that is human trafficking.
Julie, thank you very, very much, and including for that all too evocative example of the operation that you're working on. Over now to the Department of Education, the Deputy Secretary, Cindy Martin.
Thank you very much, Secretary Blinken. Like my colleague Julie just said, as a teacher and a vice principal and a principal and then superintendent, most recently in San Diego, I saw firsthand the risks that our students faced in our city. San Diego being a border city and a major port, commerce, and entertainment city. So I cannot understate the importance of identifying, preventing, responding to human trafficking as an issue that I personally take very seriously, seeing the impacts of our students on our students. And then I know the entire education community and the ecosystem can see how important that our role is so that we can prevent and protect And we do it with the evidence-based practices that are going to help with awareness, identification, and response to incidents. Just a small fact that human trafficking from recent accounts in San Diego alone was an $810 million industry. And it put San Diego as one of the top 13 cities in US for human trafficking. That's just at that scale. I know cities all around the country are grappling with this reality, and the roles that our schools and institutions can play in response can't be understated. There are solutions that we can build together, and we do it through this really powerful interagency collaboration and a laser focus. Because I saw firsthand when we do that, I saw it as a local leader taking that understanding along with the partnerships with local law enforcement, community organizations, how it helped us come up with real solutions on the ground that made a real difference for students. I want to mention that Secretary Cardona and I are committed that the Department of Education is going to continue to do our part so we can raise the awareness around human trafficking in school communities across the country and offer the helpful resources that administrators, teachers, school counselors, food service workers, bus drivers, custodians, nurses, all the specialized instructional support, parents, caregivers, everybody can come together and combat human sex and labor trafficking. So with that in mind, I want to share that at the Department of Ed, we have several activities that are planned right here and now for fiscal year 2022 around this important topic. First of all, we have a 3-part human trafficking professional development webinar series that's designed specifically and targeted for educators so they can recognize the risk. They can see the risk factors and they can see signs and respond to suspicious activity. Once they see the risks, there are real actions that they can take. Through these webinars, we will expand the field of knowledge so people can take real action. The webinars will be distributed broadly as a part of the Department of Education's efforts to recognize January as Human Slavery and Human Trafficking Prevention Month. Second, we have a series of 6 webinars for fiscal year 2022 also to share information and all the resources on the subtopics that are related to labor and sex trafficking, including things like cyber trafficking, which we all know has become prevalent during this pandemic. And then we have the development of some really easy to use communication tools that we know states and district localities need, resources to get out to the schools and to the districts that will support their local efforts at trafficking prevention and intervention efforts. And these are in really easy to use forms, posters and easy to carry palm cards that allow the conversation to happen, that allow intervention and protection to take place. And I just have to end by saying I'm very proud and excited that the department's nominee, the Department of Ed nominated for the Presidential Award for Extraordinary Efforts to Combat Human Trafficking. As you mentioned earlier today, Tanya Gould has been selected to receive the important award, and that was the Department of Ed's nominee. Ms. Gould has supported our department's efforts to combat human trafficking. There's nothing more powerful than a story and her personal experience, being able to share that and help the field understand and inform administrators and educators and personnel across the country. We thank her for her efforts and for being recognized today. Thank you very much, and congratulations to Tanya.
Hey, Cindy, thanks so much. And thank you for highlighting Tanya's extraordinary work, but also thank you for bringing your own personal experience with you and that focus that you already had to this effort to Ed right now. So now really to, in so many ways, the front lines of this effort, to the administrator of USAID, Samantha Power, because the men and women of AID are really, quite literally, on the front lines every day. Samantha, over to you.
Thank you so much, Secretary Blinken. Of course, right with our State Department colleagues, our justice colleagues, all the people we've heard from today, it is a whole of government frontline effort more and more. It's been really inspiring and extra motivating to hear from so many colleagues and agencies about all that they are doing, and especially to hear the extent to which this work clearly stems from deep personal commitments, as well as the leadership of President Biden and Vice President Harris, which, as you noted, Secretary Blinken also itself follows the leadership in a bipartisan manner now over several decades. As many have said today, human trafficking, the second largest criminal industry in the world after the drug trade, affects 25 million people each year. Today, I want to just start by talking about one person who has given us permission to share his story, Saiful Islam. Saiful was the youngest of 7 children born to a poor family in northeast Bangladesh. Despite his modest upbringing, he earned a bachelor's degree, found temporary work at a rural solar company, and married and had a daughter. But when Saiful's short-term work contract expired, he was unable to find another job. A local recruiter offered him an attractive job as an electrician in Singapore with a decent salary. Saiful sold the little land he had inherited to pay the $7,000 for his airfare and fees. But, and we all know where this story goes, when he arrived in Singapore, his world began to unravel. He was told he would work as a mason, not an electrician, for half of what he was originally promised. And even that proved a lie. In the end, he got no pay and barely enough to eat. After a year of fundraising by his wife, he was finally able to afford a ticket home, having lost his land and his money, and he had no better prospects than he had had before. Then he heard about an event sponsored by USAID to counter human trafficking. Through the program, he received counseling for his trauma, but also entrepreneurship training. Soon after, he opened a market stall to sell electronics, bringing in not only enough income to support his family, but enough to create a fund to support other survivors of human trafficking. I use that word very intentionally, survivor. For decades, the human trafficking community had come to see people who experience the horrors of forced labor, sexual exploitation, or violence as victims. Through President Biden's National Action Plan and USAID's newly updated counter trafficking in persons policy, released in December, we've recognized that trafficking survivors need to be leading the change that we seek in the world. For 20 years, USAID has contributed to the US government's global anti-trafficking effort, providing more than $340 million in assistance in 83 countries. Our new policy builds on that legacy and works to empower survivors, creating programs that aren't just focused on them, but that are led by them. The policy also identifies key priorities that serve.
So I guess the State Department is holding a press briefing right now and has been for like 15 minutes. Press 1 if you would rather watch the State Department press briefing than this.
The target of human traffickers. By some reports, women and girls account for 99% of all victims in the commercial sex industry and 58% in other forced labor sectors. Through our global labor initiatives, we are fighting gender-based violence and harassment in workplaces, facilitating stronger female representation in labor organizations and unions, and increasing dignified work opportunities for women and other marginalized populations. Second, we are elevating the importance of migration and forced labor that is hidden in the global supply chain.
Last week, and the Secretary had an opportunity to speak to Chancellor Schultz, had an opportunity to meet with Foreign Minister Baerbock. The Foreign Minister was asked almost precisely this very question, standing next to Secretary Blinken. And she spoke in detailed terms about the important forms of support that our German allies are showing to our Ukrainian partners. And I say our because they are close partners of both the United States and Germany, not to mention all of the NATO allies. So different allies are contributing different elements to this effort to reassure, to reinforce, to deter further Russian aggression. The key is that all of these forms of support are reinforcing. So whether it is the fact that the United States, for our part, has provided more than $650 million in security assistance in the last year, the more than in any previous year in history. Whether it is the fact that Secretary Blinken himself has expedited and authorized the third country transfers that you have spoken to, whether it is the reinforcements that my colleague at the Pentagon has spoken to in recent days, we are making important contributions not only to the defensive security needs of Ukraine, but also to the reassurance efforts when it comes to NATO's so-called eastern flank. Our allies are very much doing the same. Different allies are contributing in different ways in a way that is mutually reinforcing. And then finally, your question about what we're hearing from our Ukrainian partners. Look, I would make the point that now is not the time for panic, now is the time for preparation. That is precisely what we're doing. We have been clear about our concerns We have been clear about the depth of those concerns. You all know why. You all know our reasoning. That reasoning is clear, given what we're seeing on Ukraine's borders, what we're seeing in what should be an independent sovereign country of Belarus, with the Russian military buildup there, what we're seeing with preparations for potential hybrid operations. All of this is cause for concern, but certainly no one is calling for panic.
But just to follow up, because precisely I didn't get an answer on Germany. Different countries participate in different ways. Is it helpful if Germany prevents Estonia from helping to arm Ukraine? Or does it undermine the unity of the alliance?
The alliance is united. There is no question about this. The alliance is united. You have heard this in the form of communiques and statements from the alliance itself. You don't have to. You don't have to take my word for it.
But why would Germany stop artillery from going to Ukraine?
Countries
from a third country.
Countries have different authorities, different norms, different traditions. This country, what I can speak to is what we're doing. And what we are doing is providing unprecedented levels of defensive security assistance to our Ukrainian partners in a way that we've done in the past, just on a scale that is unprecedented.
Did the U.S. object to them imposing this ban? If they do, has the U.S. asked them to not interfere?
We have had in-depth conversations with all of our NATO allies about the deterrent measures that we are prepared to take, about the response, the swift, severe, united response that we are prepared to take. Our NATO allies know precisely what we are doing, many of the steps you've just heard me detail in terms of our provision of defensive security assistance to Ukraine, in terms of the reinforcements that we are making and prepared to make to NATO's eastern flank. Different NATO allies are contributing in different and meaningful ways. Francesca.
Thank you. Just to follow up on Andre's question on Macron's engagement, you're saying that everything you've done was made in coordination with your partners and allies. Would you say that Macron talking with Putin is done in coordination with the U.S.?
Look, the level of coordination between our French allies and the United States has been excellent. I think our French allies would say the same. As you know, there even in recent hours have been very high-level discussions. So these conversations, these consultations have been constant and consistent. So we feel that we have a good sense of what the alliance, what our allies are doing, and we know that we've been fully transparent with our allies and partners.
So just coordination and communication is better than it was over AUKUS?
Was that a question, or was that a jibe?
Just a quick one. On the president said during his press conference, he kind of acknowledged that Ukraine is not going. It's not very likely that Ukraine is going to join NATO in the next upcoming years. Is this an acknowledgement you're ready to put in your written response? Just saying, we don't shut the doors, but it's not likely that Ukraine is going to join in the upcoming future.
Francesca, we've consistently made the point when we talk about the foundational, inviolable principles, one of them, when it comes to European security, is the right of sovereign nations to choose their partnerships and alliances in any way that they see fit. It is written into NATO's charter that countries can aspire to join the alliance. Of course, there are a set of membership requirements. Those membership requirements are clearly spelled out, clearly delineated. It is the obligation and responsibility of each aspirant country to be in a position to fulfill those requirements. But NATO's door must always remain open to those aspirant countries that fulfill those requirements.
That wasn't my question. My question is, are you ready to take the quote from President Biden in his press conference? The likelihood that Ukraine is going to join NATO in the near term is not very likely. Are you ready to take that quote and put it in your written response?
An open door is an open door. That door will always be open. We're not going to take any move. We're not going to say anything that would...
The president just did.
I don't think the president did. I think
No, he said that.
the president said exactly what I reiterated just now, that NATO accession is predicated on a set of requirements that each aspirant country must fulfill. Cut it.
Just because we're focused on this written response right now, I know you aren't going to preview exactly, what this is going to say, but for our expectation purposes, will this written response speak in broad terms that you have already made very public about the ideas that the U.S. sees for the U.S. and Russia potentially working together on strategic, stability and the like, or will it have specific ideas, specific proposals that are on the table for negotiation's sake?
I think the answer to that is both. We've been very clear about the areas in which there may be some utility and where progress can be achieved when it comes to enhancing transatlantic security, when it comes to enhancing collective security, when it comes to addressing some of the concerns that Russia has put forward. And so in the discussions with Foreign Minister Lavrov and the discussions with Deputy Foreign Minister Ryabkov and the discussions at NATO and the discussions with the OSCE, there have been broad, high-level discussions about various principles, including the principle we've just discussed here. But then there have also been more tactical discussions, discussions about the placement of missiles, discussions about reciprocal steps vis-a-vis exercises, about confidence-building measures, about transparency, about broader arms control. So the universe in which we can engage diplomatically, or at least in which we can engage diplomatically and potentially achieve some progress, we've outlined what that universe looks like. The Russians know that. We've done that together with our allies and partners, and the written response will do that as well.
Sorry, so you said you outlined that, right? So are we expecting that there should be a bit more filled into that outline in this written response than we have seen publicly?
What the written response will reflect is what we have said, and that is the fact that there are certain areas that for us are non-starters, and there are other areas where dialogue and diplomacy has the potential to enhance collective transatlantic security and also account for some of the concerns that Russia has made. I don't want to get ahead of a report a written response that we haven't formally transmitted yet, but again, we have been entirely clear about what those universes are, where that Venn diagram of Russia's stated concerns, our stated concerns, the concerns of NATO, of our European allies, of our Ukrainian partners. We've been clear that there is an overlapping element of that Venn diagram. And that's what we're talking about here in terms of pursuing dialogue and diplomacy on the path towards de-escalation and hopefully a peaceful resolution of this needless Russian aggression. That is a proposition we're prepared to continue to test. We'll have to see how the Russians respond, what the next steps might be, but the next step will be transmitting that response to the Russian Federation. Yes.
Thank you. Just to be clear, your answer to Francesco was no. You will not be including a characterization of the likelihood or not of Ukraine joining NATO. You said open doors and open doors and open door. And
so I would say a couple things. One, an open door is an open door. Two, our response to the Russian Federation was drafted and is being drafted in full consultation and coordination and transparency with our European allies and Ukrainian partners, but it is a U.S. response. So it is not for the United States to speak to NATO's posture in any written response that we put forward. So I think for a couple reasons, that is not the kind of thing I would expect to see in any written response from the United States.
Okay, when you talk about it not yet being transmitted, are you also saying it's not yet fully drafted, even though, because you keep saying that you're consulting still, even though you also are saying that it's everything we already know and have said, so you are still drafting? as well as not having.
I don't want to characterize its state of completion. I will say that Secretary Blinken was clear that it will be transmitted this week. So I would just say stay tuned. It will be a U.S. government response.
I just wanted to ask, you and your colleagues sometimes talk about diplomacy and dialogue on the one side, defense and deterrence on the other, with President Putin kind of deciding in the middle, like some kind of magic 8-ball or something. But we're seeing signs on the ground. You mentioned the MOEX stock exchange, the ruble weakness. We've seen troops going into Belarus. We've seen NATO directing troops toward its eastern flank. Does that mean that the scope for diplomacy has narrowed?
What it means is that we haven't seen the de-escalation that is necessary if diplomacy and dialogue is to prove successful. We've been very clear that, as we always are, that there is not a precondition for dialogue and diplomacy, but there is a precondition for that dialogue and diplomacy moving in the right direction. And moving towards the end state that we hope to see, and that precondition is de-escalation.
Is it moving in the right direction or the wrong direction? I mean, things rarely stand still in this world.
Well, I don't think that we've seen any concrete indications of de-escalation just yet. Yes. Anything else on Russia-Ukraine? Sure.
You were talking about the unity among allies. I wonder if you wanted to respond to the Croatian President Milanovic, who said Croatia would in no way be involved in this crisis if it's escalated, and they will, specifically said we will recall Croatian troops from NATO deployment. So, what is there real unity among your allies on this?
I think you have seen the unity that has been expressed in formal statements from NATO, from the G7, from the OSCE, from the European Commission, that speaks to the unity that we have forged, not in recent days, but really in over the past couple months. This is something that we have been hard at work at since we first started speaking to this in early November, if I recall. This is something that, as the information picture has developed, we have consistently shared information with allies and partners. We have engaged with our allies and partners in any number of fora, both in person, whether it was last month at the G7, whether it was at the NATO ministerial, whether it was at the OSCE. We have done so over the phone as well, video conferences, well over 100 engagements as of earlier this month with our European allies and our partners as well, of course, including Ukraine. And that extends to last week when we were again in Kiev. We had an opportunity to meet with President Zelensky, had an opportunity to meet with Foreign Minister Kuleba, and that engagement has continued since. Of course, the Secretary has had an opportunity to speak to the Foreign Minister after his meeting with Foreign Minister Lavrov to back brief him on that engagement, because again, we are operating with a core principle in mind, and that is nothing about without, nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine, about Europe without Europe, about NATO without NATO.
Specifically on Croatia, are you concerned that countries are signing up to formal statements and then on the other side making these kind of comments that they don't actually support this?
What I can point to are the formal statements that NATO allies have signed up for.
You're not concerned at all that if the commander-in-chief of a country is then saying something completely opposed to what they've supposedly signed up for?
Documents are a physical manifestation of the commitments that the allies have made. I can point you to those documents.
And if it comes to, John Feiner, Deputy National Security Advisor John Feiner has said that NATO will make decisions about possible troop movements. You talked about there's no daylight on the sanctions response, but what about on potentially deploying NATO troops? Are you concerned that there isn't the same level of unity, perhaps, when it comes to that military aspect on the eastern flank, not Ukraine?
Well, the alliance has been very clear, just as the United States has been very clear about our commitment to reassure, to reinforce the eastern flank, certainly if there is renewed aggression, if there is a military invasion. But as you heard us say yesterday, We've never said that even in the absence of that, we wouldn't take prudent steps to provide that reinforcement and reassurance. But I will leave it to the NATO alliance to speak to the specifics of those plans. Joel.
A couple of questions on both the diplomatic and deterrence piece. The Baltic states, of course, announced last week that they will be providing anti-armor and anti-aircraft weapons, and Secretary Blinken emphasized that he approved this. Do you think that's an adequate upgrade of Ukraine's anti-aircraft defenses, or are you considering any other more substantial reinforcements?
Well, what you're referring to is part and parcel of a much larger effort on the part of various countries around the world, including many in the NATO alliance, to provide additional defensive security assistance to Ukraine. You've heard me say this already today, but for our part, the United States has provided more than $650 million in the last year in defensive security assistance, more so than any previous year. The $200 million in additional security assistance that was approved last month, I believe the second delivery of which arrived overnight in Kiev. So you can speak to what our Baltic allies are doing, you can speak to what other European allies are doing, you can speak to what the United States is doing. And the totality of that should send a clear signal to the Russian Federation or any other aggressor that Ukraine's partners are providing and prepared to provide Ukraine with what it needs to defend itself.
Right. I've heard questions. Should we expect more Stingers to go to Ukraine than the batch announced, and or even Patriots? Anything to? Obviously, there's an imbalance of Russian air capability.
So what I would say is that the second installment, I believe, of that of the deliveries associated with the $200 million that was approved last month in December by President Biden, those deliveries will continue in the coming days and coming weeks. You saw that there were pictures and imagery broadcast of that delivery overnight, and I expect you'll be hearing more about subsequent deliveries of defensive security assistance in the days and weeks to come. We've provided some details of that. I believe last weekend we spoke to 200,000 pounds of ammunition that was provided to our Ukrainian partners, but we're of course not detailing all elements of that defensive security assistance we're providing.
On the diplomatic side, the French have talked about sort of reviving the Normandy format, or to some extent. Do you see the implementation of Minsk II as a diplomatic off-ramp from this threat of a new invasion? And would that require Ukraine to move towards some kind of special status for Donbass before recovering control of its border there?
Minsk is an important roadmap. It's an important ingredient. We see full implementation of the Minsk Accords as an important way forward. It's also a fact that there's one country that has been the primary violator of the Minsk agreements, and that one country is Russia. You heard Secretary Blinken in the OSCE in Stockholm last month delineate, almost line by line, the various elements of those agreements that the Russian Federation has not lived up to. In all of our engagements with Russia, the United States, our NATO allies, we have made clear the importance of full implementation of the Minsk agreements. And again, there is one core violator of those agreements. Yes?
So your Pentagon counterpart said yesterday that the U.S. is ready to send more capabilities to the eastern flank countries independently of NATO if they need it. So he said that. And well, these countries have been pretty open about their desire for an increased U.S. presence. So does that mean that it's basically a done deal? And when might we expect a decision? And second, if I may, the Belarusian dictator Alexander Lukashenko felt it necessary recently to stress that he will not allow any occupation of Belarus, presumably by the Russian forces that are coming, which of course prompted concerns that this is in fact what might happen. And there have been concerns about that. Are you concerned about such a scenario of Russian forces basically occupying Belarus?
So to start with your first question, I know my Pentagon counterpart and predecessor has spoken to this in recent days. He's spoken to the number of service members at a heightened state of readiness and contextualize the fact that this order will ensure that they are a heightened preparedness to deploy and provide support should they be called upon. But he was also clear that they have not been activated for deployments. These are the types of decisions that will be made as an alliance, as the full NATO alliance. So I would defer to my Pentagon counterpart and to NATO to speak to the next steps.
So if he also said that the U.S. might send additional capabilities independently of that NATO response force if there's a need, and he said that the U.S. is open to provide that. So is that, I mean, Baltic states and Poland have been pretty open that they want this increased presence.
I will leave it to my Pentagon counterpart to speak to potential deployment of service members. They've spoken extensively to this yesterday and in recent days. When it comes to Belarus, we have been clearly voicing our concerns with the military buildup in what should be an independent, sovereign country. Russia's surging of troops into Belarus is a cause for deep concern. That surge, as I alluded to a moment ago, threatens Belarus's sovereignty. It undermines its status in some ways as an independent country. We also know that Belarus has been an increasingly destabilizing actor in the region. You need look no further than the Lukashenko regime's attempts to cruelly weaponize the flow of innocent migrants, the migrant crisis that the regime orchestrated. And the other point I would make is that just as we've been clear with the Russian Federation about the severe costs that would befall them were this to move forward, in recent days we've also made clear to Belarus that if it allows its territory to be used for an attack on Ukraine, it would face a swift and decisive response from the United States and our allies and partners. We would, if an invasion were to proceed from Belarus, if Russian troops were to permanently station on their territory, NATO could well have to reassess our own force posture in the countries that border Belarus. But to your question, the permission structure that the Lukashenko regime has provided to Vladimir Putin to station a large number of Russian troops on what should be sovereign Belarusian soil, that is an affront to Belarus's sovereignty. It is another indication that this is a regime that has little regard for its own people, little regard for the state, and the most regard for the survival, the welfare of the regime itself. One more question on Russia, Ukraine? Sure.
Does the U.S. have any indication that Russia will refrain from invading Ukraine during the Beijing Olympic, which is February 4th to 20th? One would argue that why would Russian President Putin want to upset Chinese President Xi Jinping at a time when they need each other much more than in 2008?
That's a question that is better posed to Vladimir Putin. It is not up to us to try to divine, try to predict what he may or may not do. It is, however, a simple historical fact, as Secretary Blinken alluded to a couple days ago, that a previous Summer Olympic Games, if I recall, did not prevent Vladimir Putin from going into another independent country. So I think all that says, you'll have to ask Vladimir Putin.
One would argue because in 2008, Chinese leader Hu Jintao has a different relationship with Putin, and now Xi Jinping is in power. He has a different relationship with Putin, and that many things have changed. So would you just said that it's not a time to panic. Is there any indication diplomacy will prevail during that period of time.
Is there any indication that
That Russia will refrain from further military escalation?
that's a question you'd have to pose to Russia? Yes.
Yesterday you opened up the briefing condemning the Houthis' attack on UAE and Saudi Arabia, and you said that putting them back on the terror list is under review. Can you just explain to us what does under review mean? It's just like you want to see them more engaged in terrorist attack? Is it a legal issue? What does it mean? And some reports indicating that both the Pentagon and the CIA are actually agreeing that they should be put back on the terror list because they threat international water, world economy, etc. So what does under review means?
Under review just means that it's something that we are taking a close look at internally within the U.S. government to determine what would best serve our national security interests, what would best serve our desire to be a partner to Saudi Arabia, to the UAE, to other countries that are threatened by these Houthi attacks. What would also allow us to best serve our interests in bringing an end to this civil war in Yemen that has not only wrought horrific violence and instability across the country, but has led to a humanitarian catastrophe. If I recall, there are more than 16 million Yemenis who are suffering from food insecurity. And so we're taking all of this and more into account as we determine the next best steps. We will continue to work with our allies and partners in the region, especially to promote accountability for the Houthis, for those Houthi leaders that have been behind these terrorist attacks. We have done this in recent weeks, in recent months, using a variety of tools, including sanctions. I would venture to guess you will see additional steps on our part to hold to account those Houthi leaders who are responsible for these reprehensible attacks. As I said yesterday, we're not going to relent in designating Houthi leaders and entities involved in military offensives that threaten civilians, that threaten regional stability, that perpetuate the conflict, those who are responsible for some of the human rights abuses or the violations of international humanitarian law, or that exacerbate the humanitarian crisis. When you talk about the humanitarian crisis, there is one actor that is primarily responsible for the suffering of the Yemeni people, the widespread suffering of the Yemeni people, and that is the Houthis. So we are using every appropriate tool, and we will continue to use every appropriate tool to hold the Houthis to account.
Okay, I have two more questions on Iran. The former prisoners who've been held in jail in Iran went on hunger strike in Vienna, as you know, and Rob Mali issued a statement. They wanted basically to make sure that the release of U.S. hostages in Iran is a precondition to negotiation with the Iranian regime. The Iranians said they're adamant that that's not going to be linked. So despite your commitment to that, how are you going to deal with the fact that Iran refused to discuss the release of the prisoners and give assurance to their families that you're doing everything to make sure that they are released?
So let me spend a moment just on Barry Rosen, one of the former embassy hostages you referenced. And you heard us welcome the end of Mr. Rosen's hunger strike, and we applaud his heroic efforts to help secure the release of all foreign and dual nationals held by Iran. This is a challenge that continues to have, to your question, our full attention. Barry Rosen, his colleagues, they're heroes. And that's why Special Envoy Mali met with Mr. Rosen in Vienna and will, of course, meet with him again at any time to hear his important perspective, to hear his thoughts. We are deeply moved by his commitment to the release of those American citizens and third country nationals who are wrongfully detained in Iran. It's a commitment that we completely share. You heard from the Special Envoy that we are continuing to pursue separate, indirect talks with Iran to secure the release of those who are unjustly held by the regime. You have heard us make the point that it would not serve our interest. It certainly would not serve the interests of the Americans and third country nationals who are unjustly held in Iran to tie their fates to a proposition that is at best uncertain, and that is the proposition of a mutual return to compliance with the JCPOA. That is a proposition that is at best uncertain. We want the return of Americans and these third country nationals to be a certainty. That is our goal, to bring them home, to reunite them with their families. And so, of course, we do not want to have anything unnecessarily stand in the way. So we'll continue to treat these issues as separate as we strive to secure their release.
Okay,
Francesca?
and one more on Iran. Is there any division within the negotiation team in Vienna? I mean, is Mr. Nephew or in agreement with your policy, or does he disagree that the way you're handling imposing the sanction on Iran, the way you want to implement it, is different than that of Rob Malley and others?
Well, I'm fortunate to say that Richard Nephew is still a member of the State Department team. He no longer serves as the Deputy Special Envoy for Iran, but as you know, a year into an administration, personnel moves are common. Of course, we're not going to get into the specifics.
In such a sensitive time, it's common for them to leave when they negotiate a deal that is hinged on getting back to this agreement?
Well, look, I'm not going to comment on the specifics of any decision of someone to take a step back from a particular account, but you've seen across the administration that, especially at this time, a year into the administration, there have been a number of personnel moves across a variety of fronts, including on high-profile issues. The fact is, and I think the broader context here, is that the previous administration, we've been clear about this, left us with a terrible set of options. The maximum pressure campaign was an abject failure. Everything that it promised, the opposite ended up coming true, whether it was promises of a better deal, whether it was promises of a subdued Iran, a cowed set of proxies and terrorist affiliates, whether it was putting the brakes on Iran's nuclear program, whether it was bringing together the world to bring about maximalist demands on Iran. Across all of those areas, the opposite came true. We inherited an Iranian nuclear program that was galloping ahead, that has continued to gallop ahead, and an Iranian nuclear program that was not subject, unfortunately, to the most stringent verification and monitoring regime ever negotiated, and a verification and monitoring regime that was working, and verifiably so. Working according to the State Department, working according to our intelligence community, working according to the IAEA, working according to our allies and partners. So having inherited a very difficult and challenging, terrible even, set of options, we've set about a path that we believe is in our national security interests, and that is a mutual return to compliance with the JCPOA. It's a path that up until now has been, in our estimation, the best way to once again put those stringent, permanent, verifiable limitations on Iran's nuclear program, but we've been equally clear that there will come a day, and there will come a day soon, when the non-proliferation benefits that the JCPOA promised in 2015 and that were implemented in 2016 will be watered down and eroded by the advancements that Iran has made since the last administration left the deal in its nuclear program. So right now we are still seeking to achieve a mutual return to compliance, but we're weighing all options and weighing alternatives. Francesca.
Quick one on Iran, very quickly. What happened since yesterday and when the foreign minister, Iranian foreign minister, said they were open to direct talks? Have you reached indirectly out to them saying, okay, you're open, we're open, let's do this now and just meet?
Well, I wouldn't want to speak to anything like that, but you know, it would not take us reaching out for the Iranians to know precisely where we are and what we have long preferred. We've been very clear.
Yeah, but just to organize an actual meeting.
Well, we again we have been open to sitting down directly with our allies and partners, with the Iranians since this began last April, I believe it was. So it is up to the Iranians to make good on that statement. We do believe that it would be more productive to engage directly with Iran when it comes to JCPOA, when it comes to other issues. It would also enable more efficient communication, and that is what we need, especially at this moment, when we have precious little time left in an effort to try and salvage or to effect a mutual return to compliance with the JCPOA.
So nothing else happened since yesterday on that.
Nothing else to announce.
Can I go to Egypt real
Sure.
quick? So back in September, the Secretary made this designation that he was going to withhold, or that the U.S. was not going to spend this $130 million foreign military financing unless Egypt met certain conditions. A couple hours ago, several Democratic Congress people wrote to the Secretary asking him not to certify that those conditions have been met. And I don't know if such a determination has been met, but I do notice that just a few minutes ago, you guys announced $2.5 billion in arms sales to Egypt. Is any of that $2.5 billion part of the $130 million in foreign? I mean, that $2.5 billion is astronomically more than $130 million, right?
So Matt, you won't be surprised to hear me say that we don't comment on congressional correspondence. We don't have anything new to announce when it comes to the FMF and the decision that was made in September that you referenced. What I can say now is that we may have more to say in the coming days, but what you've already heard us say remains the case, that we remain committed to engaging with our Egyptian partners on human rights.
Okay.
We have consistently emphasized that our bilateral relationship would be strengthened by tangible improvement in respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms.
So you can't say whether this $130 million is part of the $2.5 billion?
If we have anything to add on that, we'll get back to you.
Well, then I just want to, what is the point of withholding $130 million in foreign military financing when you're just going to turn around and sell them $2.5 billion in weapons?
Matt, if we have anything to add on that on the report you're referencing, we'll let you know.
It's a report. It's an announcement from PM.
Let you know. Sure.
Made any progress on human rights in the last year?
We have spoken to steps that have been welcomed, that we have welcomed, but this is a dialogue that is ongoing, and we've consistently made the point that as we have seen progress on individual cases, that additional progress across the board would only serve to strengthen our relationship. Our relationship with Egypt is fundamentally important across any number of realms when it comes to regional security, when it comes to counterterrorism, and so of course we would like to see that relationship strengthened even more, and one way to do that is additional progress on human rights. Yes, Andrea.
2 more cruise missiles, 5th launch in 1 week from North Korea. Do you have a new policy to try to get them to answer your messages?
Well,
not yours personally.
You have heard us speak to our approach to the DPRK. It is a policy that was formulated in the early days of this administration that we developed in close coordination with our allies and partners, especially the ROK and Japan. We've had a number of engagements with them in the trilateral format, knowing the importance of trilateral cooperation when it comes to that ultimate goal, and that's the complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. We have also been very clear about our intent. Number one, we have no hostile intent. We harbor no hostile intent towards the DPRK. We are open to dialogue. We are open to diplomacy. We think dialogue and diplomacy is the most effective means to help us reach that overarching goal, and that's the complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. If you're referring to the reports overnight, we are still assessing the ROK in Japan. Those reports, I don't have any further details to add at this time, though. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Well, that wasn't weird at all. Nice and suspicious. Nice and suspicious. Well, whatever was going on at the White House has already ended. So that was that. That's all we had on the schedule. I will keep my eyes out for anything going on. See what else we can find today. It's a weird day. It's a weird day. I think they're all on edge about the Russia stuff, so they're just trying to talk about everything else. Lots of word salad. Lots of word salad today. But we'll see what else is going on. Oh yeah, we got some shout outs here. Let's see. Big shout out to Maybe Sunshine and Wayne. Thank you so much for the donations and the support. And thank you so much, Avon, for joining the membership program. And welcome to the family. You're officially a hooligan. All right, guys, we're going to wrap this up. Please join the Discord if you haven't already. I'll probably be hanging out in the Discord for a little bit while I'm looking for more lives and see what else I can find. Big shout out to everyone that made donations, joined the membership program, or purchased any merch. I really appreciate all of you, and I wouldn't be able to do this without you. So thank you guys so much. I appreciate all you guys being here, and I'll see you on the next live. Until then, stand tall, shine bright, and that's a wrap.